This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you all very much. My name is Gilad Halpern. I'd like to welcome you to this plenary session and thank you for coming. It is here at the 2018 Annual Conference of the Association for Israel Studies. This panel discussion is being recorded for the Tel Aviv Review podcast, of which I am co-host. The Startup Nation of the Humanities, as we like to call it, is an English language radio show dedicated to all things Israeli and intellectual, featuring long-form interviews with writers and scholars from different backgrounds and of different orientations. It is my absolute pleasure to facilitate this morning's plenary session on the topic of the Berkeley School approach to Hebrew literature. Distinguished guests today represent two generations of that school. Chana Kronfeld is a professor of Hebrew, Yiddish, and comparative literature here at UC Berkeley. She has authored, co-authored, and edited numerous books on different aspects of literature and literary theory. She has also been a prolific translator of Israeli poetry. Yael Segalovitz will soon take up an assistant professorship at Ben Gurion University's Department of Foreign Literatures and Linguistics. She has recently completed her PhD dissertation in comparative literature, also here at UC Berkeley, and herself been a prolific translator of Hebrew as well as Portuguese poetry. Thank you both for joining us today. Chana, let's start with you. I'd like to ask you a general question by way of introduction. We heard that Berkeley has long been a center of the study of Hebrew literature. I'd like to ask you, what is, or is there any, added value to studying and teaching Hebrew literature outside Israel, so far away from the mothership?
In literary studies, can everybody hear me? And thank you for coming, and it's wonderful to see old friends and hoping to make new ones. And thank you, Rebecca and Shai and everybody. In literary studies, we have kind of an aesthetic criterion called defamiliarization. So in order for the aesthetic to make the ordinary perceptible, right, we need to have some distance from it because our experience of it becomes automatized. So I think that's one of the things that's enabled when you're decentered. And since a lot of my work in literary theory has to do with concepts of the minor and the marginal and how that becomes an achievement term, you know, I want to be in the margins too. There's no room, everybody's rushing there. It's really ironic but wonderful that we have had the good fortune to collaborate, especially with Tel Aviv University, but over the years with other Israeli universities as well. And as a matter of fact, historically, most of our graduate students have been from Israel, and many of them, like Yael, returned to Israel. And I think that the perspective that we develop here, which in turn started out at the Tel Aviv school that Benjamin Harshav started in the late 60s, is part of this transnational circulation of literature and of the study of literature that returns Hebrew to its multilingual, unabashedly, as I said in the clip, diasporic embrace of plurality, rather than this kind of a construction of a straight line from the Tanakh to the Palmach, skipping all points in between.
Why have these points been skipped over? Is it for ideological reasons?
You know, you guys are Israel studies folks. Yeah, I mean, we learn from literary theory, from Complet, right? From people like Walter Benjamin, who experienced it in the flesh, so to speak, that teleological, linear conceptions of history only work for, the history of the conquerors. and that we need to be able to also look at all the possibilities in the past that were not taken, right? It wasn't always going to be this way. Reading Hebrew literature of the Haskalah, of the Enlightenment period, as a direct line to the nation state is totally ahistorical. But that's the narrative that you get if you have the ideological blinders on. When you get some distance, you can perhaps see that that's just one way.
So is the fact that Hebrew literature has been so co-opted ideologically by a manifestly ideological enterprise,
Right.
does it lend itself more readily to be studied in a comparative literary perspective?
I think so, but Yael, you should jump in here because your comparative perspective and your experience both in Israel and here has really been very telling. Yes, the literature itself has always been critical of this single lens perspective. The literature has always been in dialogue with Hebrew's linguistic others, cultural others. But, both Yiddish and Judeo-Arabic or Ladino have been suppressed for ideological reasons. And the literature, if you read it in a theoretically sophisticated, rigorous, comparative context, allows you, if you allow it to theorize for you, it allows you to see what the blinders have been preventing us from seeing. But
yeah, would you like to?
Yeah, you mentioned generations, so I would consider myself a third generation of this family. I studied under Michael Gluzman, who was Chana's student and was then the head of the department in Tel Aviv, where I did my BA and MA. So for me, studying Hebrew in Berkeley made sense completely because I grew up thinking of this as a vibrant center of Hebrew literature. But it is a question that I encountered again and again. And I think one of the things, or main examples for me of what happens when Hebrew is taken out of a national or territorial context, is what happened to me, and I'm sure people of my generation would agree, with the poetry of Yehuda Amichai, which I grew up on, and I bet you did as well, as something that symbolizes conservatism, right? We memorized it, we read it again and again in every memorial service. And then I came here, and under Chana, I
hope not under.
No, under in the most symbolic of ways.
I'm sorry.
Under her guidance, opened a new door for me to be able to see a very different facet or thrust that runs through his poetry and through his prose fiction, for example. And that's something that I believe I could not have been able to see in Israel. It's very hard.
Even not in academia, where this sort of critical thinking is supposed to be lauded?
There are, of course, many things that are possible in Israeli academia that are not possible in the public sphere and are incredibly important. But I think in the case of Yehuda Amichai, it's so incredibly ossified. And as I think Bialik was for
my generation.
Exactly. That you need to extricate yourself very dramatically from context to be able to see things differently.
It's very much like what Uri Babolter, we call him Uri, describes with medieval Hebrew poetry. It's only when he taught it to me, and when Dan Pagis was here for a year, just before he died, as it turns out, and opened my eyes to the incredible beauty and diversity of that poetry, of homoerotic poems by great rabbis that are gems of poetic imagination, did I learn to disassociate, the medieval from the ossified. And you need that distance. But now, because of that circulation, that is possible in Israel. A lot of the people who were trained here and elsewhere, I'm a little troubled by it because we used to be outliers and attacked and all of that, and now it's kind of the establishment. So where did I go wrong? Mm-hmm. But
the interesting thing about Hebrew and Israel and Zionism and Israeli nationalism is that Hebrew culture not only preceded the state of Israel, that's only 70 years old, as we all know, but also Zionism as a national project. Now, for understanding comparative literature, it needs to have some sort of national grounding, I would say, in order to be universalized or decontextualized. How do you treat, let's leave medieval poetry aside for a second, but let's look at pre-Zionist Hebrew literature in the diaspora. How do you classify it? How do you pigeonhole it? Where do you place it?
I would say that it's it's interesting to me that you're asking about Hebrew rather than Jewish literature, which I think is a differentiation that we all do very automatically. And I think Jewish literature is itself a concept that is very hard to pigeonhole, right? Is it about territory? Is it about language? Is it about belief? Is it about culture? But I think what is incredible in what we think of as Jewish literature is that it is deeply, always has been historically comparative. That is, you would see texts and books that have, right, Judeo-Arabic and then Arabic or Ladino and Spanish or Yiddish and Hebrew, of course, side by side. So I would say that it is even easier to work in a comparative perspective with Jewish literatures than it would be in other places.
You preempted my next question.
So let me just piggyback on that. This is really important, and I'm really glad you brought this up because, outside of the nationalist narrative, if you tell somebody, we're only going to look at a writer's oeuvre in one half of it, not the other, right? You'd think that was crazy. But Bialik, Mendele Mocher Sforim, Fogel, Yossel Bilstein, Benjamin Harshav, all wrote both in Hebrew and in Yiddish, and yet they're taught separately and historicized separately. Similarly for the literary trends and movements, right? Haskala, Haskole, right? But never, so there's a whole set of questions that become askable, not to say answerable, only if you do a joint literary historiography. And that's the comparative moment within. But
I'd like to continue on this point and ask you about Hebrew and Yiddish literatures, sometimes, as you said, by the same authors, and ask you whether you see them as complementing each other or as rivals. In other words, are they romantic partners or evil stepsisters?
Well, Naomi is here to answer the question.
I'm sorry Naomi Zeidman is not here because that's
she
what...
is.
Naomi! Hi, Motek, you said you were going to be on a plane to Israel. Hi, Hamuda, you want to answer this question? So her first book was, not a translation, but an amazing book called A Marriage Made in Heaven, The Sexual Politics of Hebrew and Yiddish. And it should have had a question mark there with a Jewish irony, right? A marriage made in heaven, right? But of course, UC Press doesn't have a sense of irony, which is a problem as translators that we come across a lot. So, of course, it's not I'm okay, you're okay, we're all... But there is a joint intellectual project that has a lot of tensions. But I'll give you one example. If you look at this extraordinary phenomenon of women poets arising in Hebrew literature in the Yishuv, in the pre-state Palestine, in the 30s, right? All of a sudden, Dan Meron writes, Hayu lanu meshorerot, right? We had women poets. It's a great discovery. And there are, 3, 4, and there's a huge excitement about rediscovering and recanonizing them. When you look at their poetics in comparative terms, that is in terms of a rigorous literary theoretical analysis, and you see their affiliations, not just with Russian Acmeism, Anglo-American Imagism, German Expressionism, but also with the dozens and dozens of women poets in Yiddish writing between the 2 world wars. All of a sudden, they're a majority. And they're in touch. Some of them are in Israel. Some of the Yiddish poets in New York are in Israel for a year or 2. Anna Margolin, Kadia Molodovsky, etc. We are just now beginning through the research that some of our PhDs have done, to connect the dots. But for ideological reasons, those connections, which are not always sweet, but they read each other, and they're a joint literary system.
And I would add also that one of the things that I think are very special about Chana and Uri's work, at least for me, is that they enabled me to see that even languages that are not officially Jewish are and have been historically, in dialogue with Jewish culture. So they allowed me, for example, to think of Brazilian Portuguese in the context of a Jewish language, right? In Clarice Lispector's work. And so, for example, when she misquotes the Bible, instead of thinking of it as a mistake or even ignorance, I was able to think about it as a Jewish practice of repetition through change. So I think it really enables some kind of capacious view of what a dialogue between languages can enable.
What can you say about really the two stories of the comparative approach here? As you said earlier, there's the intra-Jewish sphere of several Jewish languages or dialects and literatures in dialogue with each other, and then there's the level above that of the Jewish literatures in dialogue with non-Jewish literatures. Is it, by the way, something that is really specific to Jewish literature, or do you see it elsewhere as well?
I think we can, of course, see it elsewhere. What is interesting about Jewish literature, and what I was trying to say before, is that historically it has not been at least persistently related to territory. And so while other, even Brazilian Portuguese, even though it was disseminated, of course, through colonization, has a territory to it, what happened with Jewish literature is that it is worldly or global historically. So I think it's very hard to sever, differentiate between dialogue between non-Jewish and Jewish literatures or languages and ones that essentially are defined as such.
But do you feel that these two layers, this cross-fertilization between them, or does it sometimes hinder your exploration at all?
Yeah, well, I think actually it goes both ways in a slightly different methodological tack, which is that there is something that the study of Hebrew literature in its always multilingual, multicultural context has to offer for comparative literature and for literary theory writ large. It's, we aim, and I think we have succeeded to some extent, but it's a real struggle, to de-ghettoize the study of Hebrew literature, to make our examples, to make our writers relevant for discussions of issues not just in diaspora literature, but to complicate theories of colonization, to complicate the post-colonial model, which we don't fit exactly, no matter what post-Zionists want to say. It's really sad, it's really ironic that the kind of return to or adoption of territorialism has ironically contributed to a re-ghettoization of Hebrew literary studies, where, it's just Hebrew without anything else. But when we look at all isms, at all affiliations as partial and multiple, then there's nothing threatening about it. The problem is, and Michal is here, she knows better than me, that they had the wrong philosophy of language. They really thought that bilingualism, multilingualism, is going to be a threat to nationalism. Well, it's not just bourgeois individualism, but also monolingualism makes us stupid. And we know that multilingualism is enriching in many ways, and it continues to be there, now very much with English, right under the surface.
Do you see your project as politically subversive?
I hope it's a critique in the philosophical sense of critique. I think I want to learn and to teach people to attend very carefully to language and to the ways in which the political abuse of language dulls our perception. And I think writers, especially poets, are incredible activists in undermining or working against the machbesat milim, the word laundry, right? The way in which peace ends up meaning war, etc., etc. And a word like bitachon or bitochen, which used to be, right, the faith in the divine, gets appropriated for security and the new god of the army.
Yeah, I'd like to go back to what you said earlier about colonialism. And there is really an underlying theme in comparative literature, and that is the relationship between center and periphery that does not exist or exists to a lesser extent with the globalized, universalized Hebrew literature. Where does this place your inquiry in relation to other comparative literary investigations?
Well, I would say two things. One is that I've recently read George Eliot's Daniel Deronda in English. And I remember speaking to my mom. She says, "Why does it take you so long to read it? It's such a short book." I'm like, what? It's not a short book, Mom. It's like a huge amount of pages. And then I realized that when it was translated into Hebrew, only half the story was translated.
The good bit.
The good bit that is, of course, Jewish, right? Because who cares about the other people? So this is exactly the kind of, I would say, power structure that we usually think right at the center having the power and the periphery only being influenced. But in that instance, for example, there was a periphery that was taking control of a huge amount of agency on a canonical work, to fit it to a specific kind of ideology. So what I think is happening, and this has to do with translation theory that Uri and Chana work so much on, is that translation enables a rethinking of this power structure, which of course, there is no doubt that the center in many ways has or is the center of power, but that the periphery has many ways in which it can intervene in that hegemonic, power structure, I would say, or maybe even subverse it or reverse it or rethink it.
I think that the issue of translation here would be a good segue into my next question to you, Chana, which is about the presence in English of all this. You write in English, you teach in English, you translate into English. Where do you place the English language in this multilingual matrix?
My mouth still hurts at the end of the day from speaking English. So Hebrew is always it, and I publish and write in Hebrew with great joy, and it's so much easier. It's really disconcerting after so many years to suddenly look at a page and say, does this even make sense in English? Is this a grammatical sentence? But I really see this work of mediation as important. Translation and scholarship in English for the American audience, not just American Jews, but maybe particularly American Jews who seem to be, and I'm going to offend people, really invested in maintaining this fuzzy feel-good Yiddishkeit that has absolutely no resonance of deep knowledge behind it. And, look at what's happening in the Hebrew school systems in this country. It takes a real effort to actively prevent young kids who, can absorb any language from learning Hebrew. After 14 years, they still don't know Hebrew. So there has to be some cultural investment in not knowing Hebrew. By working, Hebrew literature into the fabric a little bit, of American culture, of American Jewish culture, not that I have any illusions about the effect that my work can have or that our work can have. Maybe it's going to start tasting a little better, to put in the effort to actually develop multilingualism, because American culture is just as guilty of that ideologically driven monolingualism, except that it has the power of Imperial American English, also known in academia as the English department, where everything is done through English translation and there's no need to actually study the sources, right?
Do you feel then that your work and Alta's work and others has in a way contributed to also a better understanding of the politics of language, of literature, of Israel?
I would really hope so. I always struggled with my publishers to, whenever possible, allow annotations that give the cultural background, that allow nuance to be added, because the black and white dialogue or discourse is really, again, ignorant. I think looking at a poet like Yehuda Amichai and trying to reconstruct why he was considered dangerous, so dangerous in the early 60s that Amos Oz, together with other people, went to Ben Gurion to lehalshin alav, right, to tattletale, this is a very good poet, but he's very, very dangerous, mesukan ad me'od, to try to strip away some of the layers of appropriation and ceremonial emptiness and allow people to develop the tools, which is like learning a language, right? To actually look at what's written, to actually attend to the text. I think that's the politics, to pay attention.
Yeah, and poetry can be very interesting in that respect, because I have to say that as a translator myself, though not of literature and poetry, I see your work as a work of magic. Because for me, reading poetry is a phenomenal endeavor, and let alone trying to communicate all the different meanings and layers that are in poetry. I'd like to ask you, Yael, when you set out to do translation work of poetry, what constitutes good translation in your view?
That's an easy question. No problem. I would just add on this regard to what Chana said about the politics of their work, that for me at least, one of the important aspects of their politics has to do with pedagogy. So the way that they truly taught us to think together, to work together, to have workshops. And this is where I did the translation of Shimon Adaf into English, in a workshop with Robert Alter, and a lot of reading on Chana's side, and that there is something in their academic generosity that I'm sure, being in the academia yourself, is very striking. This idea that sharing your knowledge and sharing your ideas has something invigorating to it rather than, problematic. And so I would say that a good translation has to do with what you said before, being able to read what we call the origin, right, or the source text. It's really the most profound and intimate reading that I can imagine. You're with this author in his thoughts or her thoughts, in her language, in her associations. So I guess I feel that closest to poems or texts that I translate, in which I feel that I have been, in some almost mystical sense, with the author.
So a good translator for you is a good reader, first and foremost.
Yes.
Yeah.
Definitely.
There's a wonderful quote by a phenomenal translator, Neil Mirsky, who died recently.
Oh, I can't believe it.
Yeah, she said that translators are like concert pianists. They are performance artists. What do you make of that? Do you see, is there a significant element of interpretative work in the work of the translator?
Well, I think to translate is to interpret, right? In English, in Yiddish, Verteitschen, and Tilgum really, because it means unkelus, and the other, it's commentary. So the culture of commentary in which we have so much investment is something that, again, Jewish literary textual traditions can teach translation studies in general. I'm not sure about the performance. I am sure about the collaboration. And having lost my best friend and collaboration buddy, the other Chana, the main Chana Bloch, last year, I don't see myself translating into English again. I did translate Binyamin Harshav from Yiddish into Hebrew in a book that just came out of his poetry where, in the past, the Hebrew and the Yiddish were separated, and I completed what he didn't finish. So, and Yuda Michai died while we were translating him, and Dalia Rabikovich died while we were translating her. So there is a little bit of,
Oh my God.
My only religion now is, as I told you earlier, is poetry and superstition, so I really am afraid of the evil eye, but I think I'm done with translation.
Chana, I'd like to ask you about that Dalia Rabikovich poem that you read out.
Let me pull it out.
Yeah, it's this, about her poetry in general, and this one in particular. There's so many things that are so specifically Israeli about it, about her poetry in general. When I went to journalism school, the first thing they told us that the writer needs to know who the target audience is. Who is your target audience when you set out to translate someone who's so culturally specific as Dalia Rabikovich?
That's a very complicated question, actually, because I think that given the contemporary moment in the relationship between American English and Israeli Hebrew and the two cultures, there is no minor and major here. They're, two powerful, very different size entities. And so I really believe in a foreignizing translation, a translation that, as Benjamin and others have recommended, it goes back to Schleiermacher, pushes the target audience to work a little harder rather than domesticating it, making, for example, medieval Hebrew poetry sound like very easy modern verse, which has been done. But in this particular case, the arc of her poetry, of Dalia's poetry, is so huge from the very early poetry, which is not at all Israeli in that sense. It's very Jewish, ancient Near Eastern, right, in its cadences. And Ilana Sobel is here. You know a lot more about this than I do. And, one of the collaborations that I really cherish is having had Ilana here for a year, and we taught together. Anyway, I digress. She progressed. This is one of her last poems. It was published only after her death. And the last poems really are acts of ventriloquism. She's very often adopting the voice of perpetrators, perpetrators who are in Israel, either of sexual violence or of violence against Palestinians, or both, or perpetrators who are nostalgic for it, right, for both sexual and political violence, as they become the so-called ugly Israeli, right, in New York. Now, I believe that we had the ideal setup. Norton anthologies are not afraid of cultural and intertextual footnotes, so we did our best to have annotations. So, for example, on this poem, we say, Ad lo yada, Purim parade and carnival. The name invokes the Talmudic directive, a person should drink on Purim until he cannot distinguish, Hebrew, Ad lo yada, between cursed be Haman and blessed be Mordechai. And by the rivers of Babylon, yea, we wept, Psalm 137, the locus classicus of Hebrew diasporic poetry. So, I really see this as a pedagogic opportunity to deepen a little bit that shallow engagement with Judaism.
But in order to understand what the ugly Israeli is, you need to know what the beautiful Israeli, the Yefer Blorit Ve'atoar,
right,
symbolizes, right?
Right.
So you need some sort of background knowledge, don't you?
Yes, and you get some of it from the other poetry, from other literature, from other cultural sources, and of course a lot of it you don't. I really believe that we have come to a point, and Nomi, you wrote about this in Faithful Renderings in your wonderful book about translation. We have come to a point where the old metaphors of fidelity and betrayal, which really are, gender the act of translation in a very strange way, right? We can set them aside and instead look at the negotiations between cultures that are always partial, that are always incomplete, that translation is just one aspect of.
All right, we have a few minutes for questions from the audience, and we've got a roving mic. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Thank you very much, particularly for this amazing translation that we just heard. When I arrived to this session, I heard you speak about the discovery and the work done on Jewish poetesses. Mm-hmm. And my impression was that you were particularly talking about the Ashkenazi, and I was just wondering, what about the Mizrahi poetess, from Morocco, from Iraq, from Iran? Is there work done on them? Is there anything we should know to feel good about ourselves, that we also had culture?
I'm very, very grateful for this question, and I'm really amiss for not having mentioned it before. Just like I and some of our students have, because of my limitations, being Ashkenaziya and not having done the work of studying Arabic, there have been incredible scholars who came out of here, but also of other training places, working on Mizrahi poetry, and we actually, Ilana and I, last year brought Shlomi Chatuka here, Shimon Adaf was brought by Yael. I actually see, and I've written about this, a very important connection between the re-acknowledgement, the reopening of the amazing tradition of piyut in Mizrahi and especially women's poetry, which has never died, which always continued and continues today with neo-piyut in Israel and the work of Chaviva Pedaya and Almog Behar and lots of other people, and the work of a school like Ars Poetica with its feminist Mizrahi agenda. I devoted an entire seminar last semester to the poetry of protest in 2011 and to the work of Ars Poetica, both poetry and short stories. And the students created a dialogue in real time with Mati Shmuelov, who is in Berlin. So that whole issue of Israeli diasporic writers also came up. It's very, very interesting to see the connection between that group or those groups and groups like Ho that work, with Dori Manor and others, work with the Yiddish modernist tradition. And in the recent issue of Ho, those of you who know Hebrew, you have to read this. Moshik brings together the Mizrahi and the Yiddish or Ashkenazi-inspired poetry and the Middle Eastern Arabic poetry translated into Hebrew, as well as this whole important thing of Palestinian poets, Palestinian Israeli poets writing in Hebrew. Hebrew literature is not just literature by Ashkenazim or by Israeli Jews.
I would just add to this that in translating Shimon Adaf, one of the things that I found that he consistently does is point out the fact that as Israeli readers, many of the times we cannot recognize what is Arabic and what is Aramaic. Right? So when translating this, I had the privilege of being in constant touch with him, and he wanted to keep this defamiliarization in English as well. So I think this is the politics of form that Chana was talking about, how you invoke some kind of critique through the language, the materiality of it.
And let me just add that two of the major scholars of Mizrahi Hebrew literature in its dialogue with Arabic, Gil Hochberg, who is the endowed chair now at Columbia, and Lital Levy, who is tenured at Princeton, right? They started here. Of course, they worked with the Arabists and with me, but not only with me and with Uri. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Henriette Dahan Kalev, and I want to continue the point that started here about Mizrahim Ashkenazim. Hanan Hever writes in his book that he edited together with Yehuda Shenhab that still within all the attempts to embrace and to bring the minority of poetry of Mizrahim into the hegemonic Ashkenazi body of literature is still holding whiteness as the 0 point of reference. That is, when a Mizrahi writes, somehow he has to be legitimized as long as he refers to the 0 point of reference of whiteness, or if you want Ashkenazi, which is easier. And I agree with him. I would like to hear what you think of it.
It's a very difficult question. I would say that at least what I think is very interesting is what's happening in Israel today with Ars Poetica, for example, is that while Ars Poetica, I think, takes on, at least partially, Hanan's point of view, other poets like Shimon Adaf and Chaviva Pdaya disagree with that or try to question the very dichotomy between Mizrahi and Ashkenazi within this power structure. So whether you can be, and Ronit Matalon asked this as well, can you just be a poet in Israel today without being enforced or being questioned again and again? Are you a Mizrahi poet? Which I think Ronit Matalon and Shimon Adaf have been asked frequently. So I think what is interesting to me is rather than answering these questions, is asking about the questions, which I don't have an answer to, but do we have to still today continually ask what we think of as minority poets if they are working from their specific subversive point of view, or can they write in a voice that is more capacious? I don't know, it would be interesting to hear or think about, but I would love to hear what Chana thinks about it.
Clearly, in the social sphere, just look at the 2011 protests that I mentioned, right? The tent city in Sderot Rothschild that Noam Eshel had wonderful film clips of. They were of the, basically white middle class students who really were suffering because they, things are tough. At the same time, there was a protest that didn't get any coverage, but he covered it in Yafo, of people who really were intense because they were being evacuated. They didn't have a house to go back to because they were building, big corporate towers there. So clearly the social struggle is still very much, and maybe increasingly so, around the correlation between class, race, ethnicity, religion, and the intersectionality, that's the buzzword now, of all of these. I think when you attend to the politics of form, that is to the particular ways in which literature works, and that's my argument with Hanan, you cannot just judge by the theme. A poem or a short story is not a slogan in a demonstration. It does its work in very subtle ways that affect us even if we don't consciously understand how it's done. But it's very effective to dismantle those identity labels, especially to dismantle all the systems of separation, which Judaism has been obsessed with since the creation story. Hi, Racheli.
Do you have any profound thoughts about, I'm only interested in profound thoughts, about the Hebrew literature being written now by writers who live outside of Israel? Of course, the most prominent is Reuben M. Darin, the big controversy in Israel when he was awarded the Sapir Prize. But there's now a substantial small group, and do you see any features of this Hebrew in diaspora new literature?
I think it's a very important struggle to acknowledge the legitimacy. It's crazy that we have to even do that, right? A writer is a writer. If he writes in Hebrew, it's part of Hebrew literature. Since when have we become the territory police? I mean, one of the greatest Hebrew poets and fiction writers that we kind of rediscovered at Berkeley was David Fogel, whose Hebrew is extraordinary. Written in the 20s and 30s, he predicted the direction modern Hebrew is going to go to without any connection to Zionism. So, of course, it's really important to fight against this, what I can only describe as a growing fascism, right? It's part of a much larger trend that unfortunately we're seeing globally and increasingly in the United States, that, Israel first, America first. Hebrew literature does not belong just to Jews. It does not just belong to Israelis who live in Israel. The whole idea of a proprietary approach to the verbal work of art is disgusting to me. It really brings back, I'm a daughter of Holocaust survivors, as you know. It brings back very crazy thoughts.
And I would say that it's actually, there is real importance to this, because I think this is an experience that many young Israelis go through, that is leaving Israel, right? And going back to Gilad's question before, and we talked about it also, that if there is multilingualism in Israel today, I would say that unfortunately it should have been with Arabic, but it is mostly Hebrew and English, right? So people writing in many places, but mostly in the US, I would say, about the experience of leaving Israel, I think it has profound impact of telling a story of what it means to be an Israeli today. And just one last comment, I'm being forced now at home to see the World Cup, which I have zero interest in. But for example, you see Peru playing, and then, Peruvian fans, even though most of the majority of people in the audience are not coming straight from Peru, they're coming from wherever they are in the world, no one would doubt that they're Peruvian because this is the identity that they take on themselves. And it's interesting to me that with Israel, this is not always the case. There's always a subtle, not always subtle, critique for an Israeli to think of himself, writing in Hebrew, outside the territory as being somehow different. So I think, yes, this is very disconcerting in many ways.
Rachel Brenner, near Wisconsin, Madison. I know that I'm transgressing into a different territorial territory, but I want just to mention the name of Emil Habibi and his extraordinary story.
Right.
And the extraordinary stories that he wrote.
Right.
And the stories that he wrote in Arabic.
Right.
And he claimed that there will be Palestinian literature in Israel. He never succeeded, we know that, but this was years ago, and now we're still talking about all these compartmentalizations of languages and territories and so on. Just a comment, because I think he deserves to be mentioned.
Thank you so much for mentioning Emil Habibi's Hapesopsimist, which Anton Shamas translated into Hebrew, and still it's not considered Israeli literature. But of course, in the work of Lital, I know, but Lital Levy wrote a huge study of him, so...
Okay, I'd like to ask you one last question, because we have to wrap up soon. We haven't mentioned at all Alter's translation of the Bible. And maybe my last question will be on that. You, Yael, spoke about translating Shimon Adaf and being in touch with him about his work and working in collaboration with a poet, an author, who's thankfully still alive. What do you do when you have to translate texts that are centuries old and maybe were written in a very different context?
You have to be Robert Alter. That's what you have to do. And then you can do it.
Right.
But if you, translating Chana, translating Yehuda Amichai after he died.
Right.
I mean, you don't have the question of not knowing the contemporary context of his work, but still not being able to communicate with him directly. Does it hinder your work?
Yeah, for me, the collaboration is not so much with the writer, even though, as you know, Yehuda was a very dear friend and, of, 40 years. I met him when I was 19, working at the Televizia Limudit, at the educational television.
Was it very dangerous?
No. He was actually very sweet. It was the first pilot for Pgisha im Sofer, meeting with a writer, and we had a different writer who shall remain nameless, who scared the poor kids. This was high school kids interviewing a writer. She scared them so much that we had to stop the filming, and Yehuda came and was just so sweet, and that started a lifelong friendship. But for me, it's a collaboration with a poet who is a native speaker of the target language. So, the collaboration between an Israeli and an American, a poet and a scholar, because I'm no poet, and just a dear, dear friend, that was it for me. And with Binyamin, it was very complicated, because translating him when he was dying, right, and then after his death was really very challenging, especially since it involved a sonnet cycle, a corona, where the last line of each sonnet is the first line of the next, and then the last sonnet is that repeating line of all the sonnets. And the title is The Crack Between the Helmet and the Ground. It's from the point of view of a dying soldier in 1948. It's extraordinary.
I would just add that, the one experience that I have translating without being able to be in that dialogue, or at least not being in it in reality, is with Clarice Lispector, that I was translating from Brazilian Portuguese to Hebrew. But what Uri taught me in the workshops that we worked together is that you can allow yourself to walk with those sentences in your mind throughout the day, and that he does it very frequently, speaking the text until something comes up, or trying to have this internal vibration to see how it sounds. But yes, speaking to a ghost is very different than speaking to a living person. So I guess there is something internal that happens that is very different in those kinds of translations.
And I just want to add that Uri's translation of the Bible, I think, needs to be the next King James. The King James has some really unfortunate translations, for example, of the Song of Songs. Me'ai hamur lav is my bowels were moved to him. And this is really an extraordinary project. And I told him when he started, you're going to finish the whole Bible. He said, nah, pitom. And we're going to celebrate it in February. There's going to be a big celebration here.
When I taught his translation to an undergrad class here of Americans, they said, why can't the Hebrew Bible be so lucid? Unfortunately, that's when we have translations.
All right, I'd like to thank you dearly, Professor Chana Kronfeld, Dr. Yael Segalovitz.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Noam.
I would just like to say that if you enjoyed this conversation, feel free to check out the Tel Aviv Review archive. It has almost 500 similar discussions for you to peruse. Just go to our website. It's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. And also please consider joining the Tel Aviv Review community by giving to our Patreon campaign. For a handful of dollars a month, you'll get plenty of bonus materials, book discounts, and other perks. I would also like to thank our sponsors, the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute and the Israel Institute, and of course, the Association for Israel Studies and the Berkeley Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies for making this morning's discussion possible. Thank you very much.
Yeah.